How MPIT redefines narcissistic abuse. MPIT has a theoretical anchor map, the recursive orbital collapse, and narcissistic mirror structure in victims of abuse. We include Fairbairn's object relations triad. Fairbairn's model includes the central ego, libidinal ego, and anti-libidinal ego. We faithfully inherit Fairbairn's structure, animating it with motion. The orbit metaphor positions the libidinal and anti-libidinal egos around a disassociated central ego. The collapsed false self is orbiting rapidly between the libidinal pull and anti-libidinal push, which maps to Fairbairn's triad but visualizes it kinetically. MPIT extends Fairbairn's passive imprint idea by showing how the narcissist gaze reactivates these introjects symbolically. MPIT expansion shows that the central ego isn't just repressed, it is symbolically eclipsed by mirrored introjects and fantasy collapse. Then we have Klein's paranoid schizoid position. Klein's quote, "The omnipotent denial of the bad object is equal to the annihilation by the destructive impulse." The survivor splitting into idealized versus abuse maps directly to Klein's paranoid schizoid position. MPIT shows this is not just externalized but internalized as shame and fragmentation. But MPIT expands upon it. The shared fantasy is the denial mechanism. Collapse triggers symbolic ego fragmentation. Then we have Ferenzi's identification with the aggressor. MPIT's redeemer ego parallels Ferenzi's survival adaptation. Internalized interjects become animated, acting as internalized accusers. But MPIT expands upon it. These are not passive. They loop recursively and become agents of psychic collapse. And then we have Kernberg, the object constancy failure and splitting. The link within MPIT is the loss of object constancy, which arises from symbolic rupture, not from developmental arrest. Internalized ideal object becomes inverted and shaming. The expansion inputs on this shows the object as animated by anti-libidinal ego, now hostile and condemning. And then we have Professor Sam Vaknin, the shared fantasy and cold empathy. MPIT adopts and extends Sam Vaknin's shared fantasy framework. The gaze collapse model details how cold empathy manipulates the redeemer ego. The survivor internalizes the narcissist gaze as their own sense of self. MPIT exposes the symbolic anatomy of collapse, creating a pseudo-narcissistic internal loop. The original elements are as follows: a recursive orbital collapse, a structural loop between libidinal and anti-libidinal positions, the collapsed false self, a pseudo-ego animated by supply, orbiting the core, the deflation-inflation loop, the libidinal overactivation triggers collapse into despair, the internalized narcissist projection, reflexively shaming object replaces the loving ideal, and the central ego obscuration, the authentic self is lost in orbit, and the hall of mirrors, the survivor track, the internal architecture still trapped in the fantasy. MPIT is clinically grounded in classical theory, expanded with symbolic dynamic structure, original in metaphors and recovery model. This unifies classic psychoanalysis with survivor-centric symbolism, a new lens for understanding narcissistic collapse. Peace out. Loads of love.